Evan, it's great to see you this morning, and I'm really looking forward to a conversation about your work pertaining to disability studies and the intersection of disability studies with war and gender. I'm looking forward to talking about your book called Constructing Disability After the Great War. There's a part of the book that really overlaps with my work, and that is this 1927 American Legion pilgrimage. I'd love to hear more about how you started writing about the First World War and also about disability and veterans who returned from the war, who coped and dealt with and lived in society carrying the physical and mental consequences of the war.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I appreciate being able to be on your podcast. So yeah, I'm a historian from upstate New York. I teach at SUNY Adirondack, and my first book published in late 2024 was Constructing Disability After the Great War. Focuses on the experiences and the cultural constructions of disability by focusing on blind veterans in the United States after the war. And so I first got into this field because I was researching for my master's degree, and I found some records related to French blind soldiers during World War I and some of the efforts of American organizations to help provide relief for those soldiers as they were going through medical and social rehabilitation. And this got me interested in possibly exploring what American soldiers were going through as they experienced this as well. And so that brought me into the field of disability studies. And broadly speaking, disability studies includes historians, sociologists, many different fields, people in the field, the English field. And, one of the goals of disability history is to center the experiences of disabled people in the past, where for most of historical scholarship before maybe a generation ago, people with disabilities have been on the margins, if not completely erased from history. And so looking at how society constructs disability, how culture constructs disability, we sort of look at the distinctions between impairment, which is the bodily reality, and disability, which in many cases is socially constructed, is constructed by barriers, physical barriers, cultural barriers, right? Viewing disability as an individual deficit to overcome rather than something imposed upon people by society. They call this the medical model versus the social model of disability. And so as I got into researching this story about American blind vets, I found really fascinating contradictions between how American society constructed the image of blind veterans and how blind veterans actually lived their lives. And these two things were oftentimes vastly different, right? And so the book charts first how American philanthropic organizations worked to provide services for French soldiers before the United States was even involved in the war. Ultimately, what happens is these organizations perpetuate a extremely ableist and denigrating image of blind French soldiers, that they're depressed, that they're going to be useless for the rest of their lives. And all of this was meant to help these organizations raise money. They were drawing on the emotions of the public in order to raise money. And that relied on utilizing this really kind of horrible image of the lived experiences of blindness that didn't reflect reality necessarily, right? When American soldiers start to come home, American Rehabilitation Organization and the federal government realize that they need to shift this narrative to sell rehabilitation to the American public. And so they begin to emphasize the cheerfulness and the focus solely on the successes of rehabilitation without really understanding the lived complexities of these veterans. And so what ends up happening is you don't get an accurate depiction of their lives. You get sort of a sanitized view of their lives. And the voices of blind veterans get kind of lost. Their lived experiences get kind of lost. And so the whole point of this book is to really chart the cultural shifts in how blind veterans are talked about, but also connect readers with the voices of those veterans, because they're there. They were just sort of buried right? And so I try and reconstruct the worlds within which they lived, bring out their voices through writings and veterans organizations. And I ultimately show how these veterans lived pretty ordinary lives, and they had normal desires and hopes and dreams and anxieties and things like that. And it paints a much more interesting picture than the narratives that non-disabled Americans put forth to the public, if that makes sense. And so ultimately what happens is by the end of the book, you get a better understanding of how blind American veterans navigated post-war America, navigated the limits of ableism. And you get a sense that maybe the war um, shifted things in a slightly more positive direction. But then I get to the epilogue of the book, and spoilers, I guess. The epilogue charts the experiences of veterans in the American Legion who go to Europe in 1927 for their convention. And I follow a man named Frank Schoble. He was a lieutenant, and he was a blind veteran. He was very involved in veterans advocacy programs and issues. And through his story, you start to get a sense that, okay, maybe things didn't really shift all that much, because a lot of the same stories that we heard about blind French veterans are starting to pop up again once the war is over and once Schoble is experiencing some of these events. And so I thought maybe I'd read just like the first page and a half or 2 pages of the epilogue, just to give you a sense of how Schoble fits into this broader issue of um, veterans programs, disability, and also, for the cases of this podcast, pilgrimage, because ultimately this was a huge pilgrimage.
It was a huge pilgrimage, and I'm thrilled to be able to speak to you about how your work intersects with this pilgrimage and my interest overall in pilgrimages. I think the case of Lieutenant Frank Schoble Jr. from Philadelphia is such an important case in helping us understand what the pilgrimage meant to those legionnaires who went, and also offering a counter narrative to this grand narrative that was published by the American Legion through the voice of Schoble in his own words. So please, I want to hear I want to hear exactly what you've written.
Sounds good. All right, so I'll start. It says Lieutenant Frank Schoble boarded the SS Leviathan on September 10th, 1927, as part of the self-described Second American Expeditionary Forces. Over 18,000 veterans and their families who traveled on 27 ships to the American Legion Convention in Paris. Schoble was a scrappy young man from Pennsylvania, the son of a wealthy hat manufacturer and a student at the University of Pennsylvania, who left school just 1 year shy of graduation in order to join the U.S. Army and serve in World War I. His service ended when he was blinded in the Argonne Forest by a piece of shrapnel that led to vision loss in both of his eyes. Schoble trained at Evergreen, which was the name of the rehabilitation center for blind American soldiers, and then returned to the University of Pennsylvania to complete his undergraduate degree. He was a history major, by the way, where his friends helped him read his textbooks and his professors gave him oral rather than written exams. Throughout his post-war years, Schoble remained fervently committed to veterans advocacy, which ultimately led him to join the 2nd AEF to Europe 10 years after the onset of his vision impairment. The American Legion trip expanded beyond the boundaries of Paris that fall. Frank Schoble was part of a smaller delegation of over 200 high-ranking legionnaires who traveled to numerous cities and met with European dignitaries, the list of which included the King and Queen of Belgium, King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, the King and Queen of England. The reception that greeted the veterans was sensational when it was not somber and reflective. Almost the entire city of Nice came out to welcome the Legionnaires, as the streets were lined with American flags while people shouted, "Vive l'American Legion." By far the biggest ceremony took place in London, where the small delegation of Legionnaires paraded through the city and laid a wreath at the Cenotaph Monument, as the Big Ben Tower's clock gonged in the distance and the city was stilled with commemorative silence. Lieutenant Frank Schoble was the center of attention almost everywhere the Legionnaires went. When Schoble and his comrades visited Belgium's Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Brussels, King Albert and Queen Elizabeth, quote, drew a word of sympathy, end quote, specifically to the blind veteran. When the delegation arrived at Buckingham Palace to serve as audience to the King and Queen of England, the king moved toward Frank Schoble, quote, to grasp the groping hand of the blonde-haired young man, end quote. And Queen Mary stepped out from her place and reached for the hand which sought hers before she stated to the crowd, quote, "It is pitiful what happened with the war so close to an end," referring to the fact that Schoble was blinded in combat just days before the signing of the armistice in November 1918. The event that garnered the most attention about Frank Schoble was the Legionnaires' visit to the Vatican to meet with Pope Pius XI. The delegation gathered in St. Peter's Square before proceeding into the papal reception chamber, where the Pope entered, dressed in pure white with a large gold pectoral cross suspended from a gold chain around his neck. Before giving a speech, the Pope passed among the kneeling legionnaires, as many of them kissed his ring. Then suddenly he stopped at Frank Schoble, who he quote-unquote singularly blessed. The pontiff, according to the newspapers, placed his hand upon Schoble's blonde hair and said, "May the Lord bless you, dear boy, for what you have done and for what you have suffered. We are sure he will give you strength to undergo deprivation." There is a lot to unpack from Frank Schoble's experiences in Europe in the fall of 1927, first of which is the fact that he was the center of highly sympathetic interactions with dignitaries, which suggests that the ableism that so affected blind soldier imagery during the war years had not disappeared. Belgian and English royals, the very same royals who had served as members of relief organizations that were meant to aid French soldiers blinded in the war, extended their sympathy to Schoble, whom they viewed as being deprived of all that he needed to be happy in life, as if his blindness was somehow worse than death itself. Additionally, the writers who published such accounts replicated the sympathy in their retelling of the events. Stories like Schoble's, written by cited journalists who employed sympathetic and tragic tropes about blindness, reminiscent of the coverage of philanthropic organizations in 1915, often say more about sighted people's fears of blindness and disability than they do about actual blind people such as Schoble. The tragic ableist tropes used by American relief organizations in 1915 were also present in the religious symbolism of the media coverage of Schoble. The impulse of Christians to understand blindness as in need of divine intervention stems in part from Jesus' healing of a blind man to show the power of God. The descriptions of legionnaires' European tour are missing an important component, however, what Frank Schoble thought of it all. The reader navigates through Europe almost as a fly on the wall, observing sympathetic platitudes toward a veteran whose wound meant that he no longer had use of his eyes. Schoble occupied center stage in the story by virtue of his war service, but because of the ocular-centric ableist world within which Schoble lived, journalists may not have thought it important to find out what the blind veteran thought or felt of it all. What we know about Schoble's experience, therefore, is somewhat limited. Blind characters in fiction and nonfiction are almost always drawn by sighted writers, and because of this, depends on understanding sight as the most important of the senses. The knowledge and perspectives of blind people, such as Schoble, have been easily dismissed or considered by sighted people as downright trivial. While we can't know what Schoble thought of the press coverage of Pope Pius XI blessing him, we do know Schoble's views about blindness through his work on behalf of blind people. In the September 1920 speech to the Rotary Club in Philadelphia, Schoble argued, "It is not so bad to be blind. Our spirit is not broken. We are cheerful. We are not as sad as pictured, and do not need sympathy while we appreciate it." Schoble continuously insisted that if blind people were given social and institutional support like he was given, they would also succeed and live fulfilling lives on their own terms. At the Poor Richard Club in Philadelphia, Schoble convincingly argued for a shift in public perception of blind people everywhere. He explained how he was blinded in the war, how he learned to use a typewriter and to read with raised letters, and how he experienced depression that accompanied his early months while learning to be blind at Evergreen. That depression, however, likely had more to do with societal assumptions about blindness that Schoble internalized than about blindness itself, as Schoble himself concluded. He stated, "The blind man is the poorest advertised man in the world, because every blind man who makes a success in spite of his handicap also wants to hide his affliction from the people." Schoble ultimately appreciated the fact that his status as a veteran who was blind brought a certain level of public attention that otherwise may not have existed, but he wanted to use that attention to shift Americans' understandings of blindness as being an almost insurmountable and pitiable experience. Schoble spent much of the early 90s pleading for a training institution for blind adults so that the benefits he received as a blind veteran, touched by war's immensity, might be extended in some way to blind civilians who were largely unaffected by the war. In a second speech to the Philadelphia Rotary Club, this time in 1923, Schoble argued that the public really did not care much about blind people until the highly publicized efforts on behalf of blind soldiers during the Great War. He benefited from the public passion to rehabilitate blind soldiers and sailors, and benefited from the aid of government and welfare workers. But the question that was raised in my mind, he explained, is whether or not the soldier is the only blind person who shall benefit. Schoble argued that the entire country would benefit from better services and accessibility for all blind people, indeed all disabled people. And if the blinding of a few hundred soldiers attracted Americans' attentions to the needs of the tens of thousands of blind civilians, he says, I can say from my heart that it is a privilege to be one of that number. Quote. His sentiments, however, were overshadowed by the Pope's blessings. And so I think that's a good introduction into how the cultural narrative of Schoble literally overshadowed his own words.
As you were reading this, I was flipping through my copy of the Commander's Tour, which is the official account of this after party, so to speak, the post-pilgrimage. And I was looking specifically in the text that describes the visit to the Pope. And it's interesting, there's no mention of the Pope paying any attention to this veteran. And what is mentioned are the important political figures who were there. And I think it goes exactly to your point. I'm even looking through the photos to see clearly this was important in one sense in the media to show evidence of the Pope engaging with Schoble in this way. It's not even in the official account. And I'm curious about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so it is very interesting that he doesn't show up in the American Legion published narrative, right? And my thought on that is that if you look through the American Legion Weekly and other publications by the Legion, I get a sense that the Legion was more interested in the real life experiences of their comrades than perpetuating some of the cultural messages that the press liked to perpetuate. One example of this is at least one or two blind American veterans wrote for the American Legion Weekly, and the Weekly was very good about providing them the space for their own voice to be heard. And so in that sense, I might see Schoble's absence from the official record of the American Legion of that extended trip as maybe perhaps them not playing into the exploitative representations of their comrade, who they respected as an individual, regardless of whether or not he was visually impaired. He served in leadership positions in the American Legion. He was well respected by his fellow veterans. And so I get a sense that the Legion, those involved in producing literature for the Legion, may have had less of an incentive or less of an interest in writing sympathetic narratives about Schoble that really only served non-disabled civilians, helping them sort of feel good about his sacrifice.
I think you're making a good point about his leadership within the Legion was not necessarily inhibited because of his blindness. I think I read his obituary, and the obituary said that he was the vice commander of the Legion at one point, which is quite significant.
Yeah, yeah. And he was involved in multiple other veterans organizations. I believe he was involved in a blindness-specific organization for blind veterans. He was involved in other service-related organizations for veterans. I think one was the Veterans Organization for the 80th Division, the organization or the where that he served in during the war. So he was just really, really involved in a lot of stuff. Outspoken. He seemed very humble, even though he probably benefited somewhat from his socioeconomic status. I think his father was like a millionaire hat maker, right? But he never used that to his advantage. He was always campaigning for the rights and the accessibility of average, ordinary people. Seemed like a pretty remarkable person.
Mhm. Yeah, in preparation for our discussion today, I was thinking about some of the possible psychological responses in terms of societal responses to blind veterans in particular, and even more in particular after the First World War. And I wanted to check in with you. So one of the ideas I was thinking about is that the idea of calling someone a war hero, which was not unique to blind veterans, but the idea of projecting this kind of archetype of a hero onto veterans means that we actually we don't have to deal with our responsibility for why the veteran is disabled to begin with. If we say hero, it sort of just bypasses that. And I'm wondering if you have bumped into this with your research.
Um, yes. So is the question you're asking similar to like the whole idea of like thank you for your service sort of thing, and like
Yes.
and that standing in for making a more challenging but necessary changes in public policy, for example, that would actually improve the lives of veterans. Yeah, so I mean, I would say that people like Schoble, when they were making their speeches to organizations like the Rotary Club, there was a certain underlying sense that they felt like society needed to do more. But I don't think they were as cognizant of the whole idea of, um, you know, thanking somebody for their service or calling them a war hero absolves the civilian of their responsibility to do more. So I guess I'd say some of that is there in the 1920s, but not as prominent as it
Mhm.
would become after the Vietnam War, for example.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I was also I think about the theme of redemption a lot because it seems to be a common theme for people who go on pilgrimages. And so my mind is already kind of oriented into this theme of redemption. But the thought did occur to me in reading through your book and in thinking about Schobel's experience in particular that that we societally need disabled and wounded veterans to thrive. So we are quite invested in both their suffering and their thriving because it feeds into our narrative that this suffering can lead to transformation. So I think we project onto the disabled veteran this obligation to be inspiring, to overcome, to thrive. And I'm wondering about your thoughts around how this may or may not align with the writings that you have read that come directly from the veterans.
Yeah, that's a good question. Latching on to this redemptive story because it, in some ways, makes them feel better about what they have required of young soldiers to young men and women, whether they're soldiers or nurses or orderlies, to have sacrificed, right? So the narratives of redemption serve a purpose, right? They serve to justify war, right? In many cases, to justify human conflict that mutilates people. And so one figure that I write about in the book who's really takes this narrative to task in a brilliant way. I think I write about him in one of the chapters, I think chapter 2 or 3. But he's uh he blind in the war from not from shrapnel, not from a bullet or mustard gas, but from meningitis, from disease, right? And first off, disease was a huge contributing factor to a lot of soldiers losing their vision or becoming visually impaired, and that's overlooked or discarded in cultural narratives of blindness. It's far more interesting to civilian readers to read about somebody who's blind from a battlefield wound than somebody who had a visual impairment from a disease they contracted in a camp. But this particular soldier, he goes on to write about comedic articles about interacting with society because civilians would visit the rehabilitation center for blind veterans. And he writes about things like, we felt like monkeys in a cage as they were coming to give us peanuts. He talks about how they were eager to hear war stories, and he would tell them fictionalized war stories just to sort of play with them. And it really shifts this lens through which we understand the blind veteran experience, because you're not getting this heroic war story where civilians are giving public praise to blind veterans and calling them heroes and thanking them for their service. You're getting the perspective of the soldier on the receiving end of that stuff, right? And it gives you a sense that they themselves in the early 1920s were really cognizant of the general mood of many disabled veterans, um, and what civilian society expected them to act like, right? And so I do get into some of that. It's there. It's
Mhm.
100% there in the writings, in the experiences of a lot of these vets.
Yeah, it almost seems like there is this idea that these visually impaired veterans are like they're innocent because they can't return the gaze, or they can't see the ambivalence, or they can't see people, the viewer, the gazer looking away. And so they become a perfect screen for this projection in the mind of those that are outside of the community, when in fact what you're saying is actually no, they actually were taking back their power by toying with those who were projecting this kind of innocence and collective guilt in some way onto them.
Absolutely. They were actors. They were agents and had their own literary power, had their own voice. And it was fascinating being able to capture that voice and put it in the center of the narrative rather than having it overshadowed by the cultural messages that the press, for example, liked to.
It does seem that these veterans were, I mean, there's double weight here. They're learning to live in this new reality, and all of the changes and internal ways of coping and maybe thriving and maybe not thriving, but they're also carrying this collective weight of how society is viewing them and projecting onto them. And I wonder if you have any additional insights through the writings that you have read about an example of someone who may have articulated this.
So I can point to the experiences of one soldier in particular who explores this dynamic. And he was a blind veteran. Originally, he was from Norway. He was a Norwegian immigrant who joined during the war, was blinded from his service, and lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he opens his own coffee shop. Um, and he is very invested in this idea um, of making good, of being a productive member of society. But he's also very cognizant of how society views him, his business struggles. And uh, he identifies one of the sole causes of that business struggle as being society's inability to take him seriously as a blind person. And so he's dealing with the weight of his own expectations to be productive, and then also trying to navigate the perceptions that non-disabled society has of him. And he, without mentioning it clearly, he identifies ableism, prejudice, a belief that maybe as a blind man he isn't worthy or can't follow through in his business, despite the fact that he has all the ability to do that with a visual impairment. And so he's a good example of, I think his last name was Rittervold. He's a good example of how some of these veterans, they were caught between these competing ideas of what it meant to be a blind veteran, and what kinds of images they had to live up to.
I can imagine it would have been particularly challenging and particularly apparent, I guess, living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is sort of the heart of intellectual elitism in the United States, and then living in that environment as a blind veteran and also as a the business owner. That would have been difficult.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, and as I mentioned, difficult not because he couldn't do the work, but difficult because um he knew he could, but
Yes.
he wasn't given the chance really to do that.
I forgot to ask you actually before we started if you had some slides you wanted to show.
I do have a couple images that I could show. So the first set of images are from these the organizations that were raising money for blind French soldiers, and they employed artists to create images that would be compelling to the public, that would serve to facilitate donations essentially. And so the first one is by a American artist named FC Yan, and he depicts, and this was published in American newspapers. He depicts uh, a blind white French soldier, sort of exasperated over the fact that he had just been blinded in the field of battle, and he's raising his hand up toward the heavens and sort of appealing for divine aid. And the whole message behind this would have been, if you were looking at it, you you could help him in his quest to um, to get better, right? To find um, to find some redemption in his life. The second image here is from an artist named Emile Fuchs, and it depicts a French soldier blinded in battle. He's carrying a cane. In the background, there's a village destroyed, smoke rising in the distance, and the only thing that is, other than the cane, that is helping this blind soldier to move forward in life is the help of a young child who is holding his hand, guiding him. And this was meant to suggest that the blind veteran is the most vulnerable figure in this image, not the child, right? And Emil Fuchs's image of the blind soldier and the child was actually printed on a pamphlet handed out to people, prospective donors. This was from an organization named the Blind Relief War Fund, and they had huge galas throughout the country, especially in New York City, where they disseminated this information and the imageries and tried to raise money. And the pamphlet is actually in the archive, and if you flip it over, it has this really desperate appeal in big, bold, bright red letters, sort of saying something like, imagine yourself suddenly blinded, never to be able to see again, never to be able to see your loved ones, your children, totally helpless, right? It tries to draw out this sense of urgency and hopelessness so that you would ultimately donate money. Right. And these two images represent how the blind soldier, sort of, 10 years before Schoble goes to France for the American Legion Conference, how those same messages about Schoble were very present before the United States gets involved in the war. The next image shows one of the most well-known blind American soldiers who comes home from the war, and he is published in newspapers and magazines and official government journals, and he becomes sort of a blind veteran celebrity. His name is William Zimmerman, and he represents this shift in how the American government, the War Department, the press tried to repackage the blind veteran into exuding confidence, success, all in a way to show that this new program of rehabilitation would be much better than just providing a pension, right? The goal was to sell rehabilitation to the public, and the best way to do that was to show that in the words and the minds of those putting this message out, that even the most hopeless and helpless of disabled veterans with visual impairments, could succeed, right? And so this was meant for the American public to say, oh, well, our tax dollars are supporting rehabilitation. This is a good thing because it's helping veterans overcome their disabilities, right? And this is also meant for other veterans, because if you are an amputee, the message goes, and you're sitting in a ward at Walter Reed Hospital, and you read an article about William Zimmerman, who is blind in both eyes, and he's succeeding in life, that the idea is that gives you the grit and determination to overcome your own disabilities, which in this scenario were conceived of as being far less burdensome as being blind. And so we see, through the experience of American rehabilitation, blind veterans occupy a slightly different, though still very ableist idea of or messaging. And so ultimately they're propping up this supremely positive image of blind veterans that obscures the lived realities, the experiences of ordinary vets. And through this process, veterans blinded in war end up creating their own veterans organizations around the same time that the American Legion is created, around like the early 1920s. You also get organizations like the United States Blind Veterans of the World War, which is a group that I write about in chapter 4. Uh, and Frank Schoble becomes very involved in this organization. Um, and around that same time, he's becoming very involved in the American Legion. The image I have here is of Frank Schoble. Again, this is, I think, from his obituary, and he's shown with his military uniform on. And at that point in his life, I think he dies in the 1930s. He had been extremely involved in veterans welfare, not just going to Paris for the 1927 convention, but really traveling all over the country and going to major veterans meetings and being a spokesperson for the public understanding the lived experiences of vets. And so those are the images that I have to share.
Do you know if any of these groups traveled at all on their own pilgrimages that were only for the group members?
That's a good question. Short of having national conventions, so the U.S. Blind Veterans of the World War had their own national conventions. There were, I'd say, maybe like 100, 150 members, and not all of them would go to the conventions. One, for example, I think it was in the mid 1920s, they had a convention, national convention in Iowa, where their members would go. And it was a multi-day conference, just like the American Legion, just on a very much smaller scale. And so they traveled to different locations and had their own organizations. Eventually, so there were multiple organizations for blind vets. So that eventually, one of the major organizations, the Disabled American Veterans of the World War, ends up having a special section for blind vets, and they would have their own organizational meetings within the DAV
Oh, that's
conference and
interesting.
stuff.
Do you know if they were called pilgrimages? This has prompted me to want to do more research on these specific veterans groups.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I think they were called mostly either conventions or conferences.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't believe they called them pilgrimages. In a sense that, they were all going to serve. The main difference I would say is rather than all of them going to one location to relive or recapture the memory of a certain event, like what happens in 1927 in Paris, where they're going to battlefields, they're going to memorial sites, they're going to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and things like that. They're just going to a random city that someone picked,
Right. Yeah.
and there's no real significance for the war in those places.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I know that the devotion to Saint Lucy increased after the war. Lucy is the patron saint of blindness, and I'm curious if you bumped into this in your research with these veterans, or some of them, particularly the Catholic veterans, if they mentioned an increased devotion to Saint Lucy.
I did not encounter that at all. No, no. But it piqued my interest, and I'm going to look into that
Me
for
too.
sure.
I want to see. I think there are a couple of St. Lucie hubs in the United States. It would be interesting to see, and these places typically keep good records. It would be interesting to get into their archives a bit, which leads me into a question about your archival research for the book. You did a lot of it at Evergreen, and I want to hear a bit about that. And I think it would be interesting for listeners and viewers to know a bit more about that, what that was like for you and what you discovered there, and what Evergreen is.
Yeah, so Evergreen is in Baltimore, and actually, I did the research near there. So the Evergreen building is still there, and I can send you a picture of that as well. But it is part of college campus now. It's the
Okay.
humanities building of Loyola University, Maryland. And so, of course, when I went to do my research, I went to to visit it and see what it looked like and stuff. But most of the institutional records that I found were actually at the National Archives in College Park.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so they have the records of the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army. I think it's RG 112 for those
Mhm.
who are familiar. And so within that massive collection, you would have to spend probably multiple years to go through every box of RG 112. But within that collection, they have records from pretty much every military hospital from World War One. And so I wrote to the National Archives, which is a really you don't really think of writing to an archive to inquire about things often, but it's a very helpful, and they're great at the National Archives. Very helpful to do. So I wrote to the National Archive asking them if they had records for this specific hospital. And they did. They had at least 7 or 8 boxes of
Wow.
records. And so I made multiple trips to the National Archive to look at those records, and they gave me really interesting insight into the lived experiences in that hospital. Now, of course, it's their records made by the government, so you have to take it with a grain of salt because there's a certain perspective, authoritative perspective that doesn't take into account necessarily the thoughts and feelings of the soldiers themselves. But I got a good insight into what the institutional layout was like, how it changed over time, what was the social life like of these veterans as they were going through training, what kinds of programs they were offered. I got one of the more fascinating bits was I got in terms of understanding the social life of these veterans, disciplinary records. So one story I recount in the book is this one guy who is his praised in the newspapers and stuff. They talk about how he gets married at the hospital, but what's not covered in the newspapers about this guy, but is covered in the disciplinary records, is the fact that he goes on a drunken late night binge in Baltimore, and he and his friend come back and stir up all kinds of trouble at the hospital and break windows and throw records and wake up the other blind veterans, punch the guards in the face before getting thrown into their small jail on the campus. And so it gives you a sort of a behind the scenes look at you know these were just you got to think these were just you know young 18, 19, 20-year-old guys, uh and they were going out drinking. And the one thing that I would say was a drawback of this is where I couldn't rely 100% on institutional records is because the thoughts of the individual veterans were absent,
Mhm.
right? And you could get those in some places. One place, a couple veterans wrote frequently. One veteran, like I said, wrote for the American Legion Weekly. Another wrote like 3 books and published them, which gave me some insight into his mindset, his worldview. There are sometimes interviews in newspapers that give us some insight into their experiences. So for example, one of the places I looked was the Baltimore Afro-American, which I knew that there were 4 or 5 uh, Black soldiers who were blind from their service. One in particular was pretty outspoken about the racism he experienced at Evergreen, which is something that is not talked about in the institutional records. And so this is a guy who served in combat. He served alongside Henry Johnson in the 369th Infantry Division. He was from Barbados, lived in New York City. And at a certain point, he gets to Evergreen and gets frustrated with the fact that he's not given the same opportunities. He's told to eat in a separate dining area. This is the Jim Crow South, really, right? He's just treated very poorly, and he talks openly about it in the Baltimore Afro-American before he gets so fed up with it he just leaves and goes back to New York. Interesting thing is the white newspapers chalk this up as a win for Uncle Sam, essentially saying that Uncle Sam has sent this soldier to the best school in New York City rather than the more accurate portrayal
Mm.
that he left on his own accord because of racism, right? And so piecing together those stories, that wouldn't have been possible if I relied only on institutional records. And so I had to sort of mix institutional records, corroborating newspaper accounts, um, and other sources to try and put this together.
So Evergreen was specifically for blind veterans, visually impaired veterans, and it was intended to be a retraining center or a rehabilitation center.
Yeah, so the term they used was rehabilitation, which had uh, multiple meanings in terms of there was medical rehabilitation. So some of
Mhm,
these soldiers were close to another major hospital that was at Fort McHenry in Baltimore. And so some of them would go there for medical treatment. And they'd you know, have surgeries on their eyes. Sometimes, a lot of times, it didn't really help much. So the goal was to try and restore their sight. And some of them arrived at the hospital with these notions that they were going to be able to see again, and that wasn't necessarily the case. Um, but uh, so there was the medical rehabilitation. There was also the social and vocational rehabilitation. So they had job training programs offering things like agricultural business, offering courses in salesmanship, courses in auto body repair, right? Woodworking, things, trades that would help them succeed after they had left, right?
mhm,
And they weren't always successful. There were instances where people were successful, um, opening stores in their own hometowns, but one of the things that I cover in the last chapter of the book is some of these soldiers go home. And by 1923, 24, they're realizing that their courses in basket making or sales or something just it wasn't panning out. And so they come home and they come back to Baltimore and they end up trying to move back into Evergreen. And the problem with that is Evergreen was meant as a temporary rehabilitation hospital and it closes. And so you get this this situation where blind vets are running into a reality that their training and the lack of accessibility in society has made it so it's hard for them to make it on their own. They don't have the social supports, the institutional supports. They don't have there are so many barriers up to limit their success. And so those who are already privileged, people with wealth in their family, people who are white, people who have other advantages in their lives end up better off than those who don't have those things. And many of the soldiers who struggle voice their thoughts in meetings of the U.S. blind veterans of the World War. And another organization of blind vets becomes populated more with the soldiers who are a little bit better off. There's sort of, in some ways, a socioeconomic split among blind veterans, where you have two groups representing two very different ideas and thoughts about what blind vets needed. And they get into some debates about, do blind veterans need more social supports? Do they need a permanent home for vets to be able to live? And they didn't always agree on the answers to those questions. And so that all stems from the experiences going through Evergreen.
yeah, that makes sense. Were you able to see psychiatric records as well?
Yeah, yeah. So that's another thing that was obscured through the news articles of these veterans, is that a great majority, there's one record that stands out to me. It's a psychiatric report of every single blind veteran who was treated there. And overwhelmingly, there were some psychiatric scars, whether it was depression or anxiety or what was called shell shock. They
Mhm,
used terms like neurasthenia, psychoneurosis, right? They were present, very present in some cases. William Zimmerman, for example, the one who was prominently featured as a success case. The newspapers don't talk about the fact that he was extremely traumatized. He dealt with a lot of psychiatric trauma from his war experience. And so you see in real time the underplaying of the psychological toll that war takes on these guys.
mhm. Well, I think we still do.
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of becomes subsumed under the broader physiological or biological toll, and that is certainly less stigmatized. And we're in 2026, and it's
Yeah.
the same situation. I don't know that we have evolved exponentially since the 1920s.
No.
Are you continuing to do research in this area of the First World War and post First World War? What's on tap for you next?
Yeah. So the project I'm working on right now is sort of an offshoot of this book, in a way. So as I was going through the process of publishing through University of Illinois Press, I found a single newspaper article from the U.S. Blind Veterans of the World War Conference that referenced the fact that a woman nurse was elected vice commander of that organization,
Oh,
and they described her as a blind veteran.
wow.
So all I had to go off that at the very tail end of publishing this book, she wasn't in any of the newspaper articles that I had read. She wasn't in any of the institutional records. She wasn't covered in any of the journals, any of the War Department records. Just this one newspaper, and I had her name, and I was so curious about it, and so I'm working to reconstruct her life, and she's the center of my next project, related to the experiences not of this one specific nurse, but the broader experiences of nurses who underwent some form of illness or trauma as a result of their
Mm.
experiences in the war. And so I use this single nurse. Yes, it's a reconstruction of her life, but it's also stepping back to understand the broader picture of post-war nursing, veteran activism, health challenges, and especially cultural memory. It's so
Yeah,
asking
this
the
sounds
question
great.
why she wasn't involved in or referenced in so many
Mhm.
things.
I look forward to seeing where that develops. That
Yeah,
sounds really
me too.
fascinating. Well, thank you for taking the time this morning to talk to me about your work. I really learned a lot about disability and blindness in particular that has given me food for thought and ways to re-engage my own scholarship on these post-war pilgrimages through the lens of your work. And so I appreciate you speaking to me and appreciate the work and the research that you've done over many years on this.
Thank you. Very much appreciate having the opportunity to be on your podcast.